Lynn, the first question comes from Russia. This is, actually, it's two questions. This comes from an editor at a leading Russian weekly newspaper, which in the recent period has drawn tremendous attention to the four-power perspective that Mr. LaRouche has put forward. His first question is about the Lisbon Treaty. He says, with the ceremony that just took place, as well as the meaning of the nomination and confirmation of the new European Union leadership, what are the consequences of this, especially for Russia? My second question concerns the second phase of the financial crisis. Some people are saying that it has ended and that a recovery is going on. What are the near-term prospects? I think you kind of answered that one, but...
Well, on the second question, I would say the rebirth of the dead is not yet well established. This system is dead. There's no possibility of a recovery of this system. The only recovery possible is, first of all, is you take the dirty laundry to the laundry, and you wash all the monetarism out of it. And you come up with a fixed exchange rate credit system, which in point of fact was actually what Franklin Roosevelt had intended in 1944 when he rejected and denounced John Maynard Keynes' swindle. The problem was that in the entire post-war period, with the death of Roosevelt, the first thing Truman did, and Truman was a fascist, that's not an exaggeration. He was a Wall Street promoted fascist from Missouri. And thus, he was a Churchill supporter. The reason he got in there was because Roosevelt had a trouble in getting reelected for his fourth term because of a right-wing turn in the United States at the time. And therefore, Truman, who was acceptable to let Roosevelt be reelected, was a pig. And then Roosevelt died. And you had the experience of the head of the OSS at that time, who went in to see Roosevelt after he'd been reelected and reinstalled in office, re-sworn in. And he came out of the meeting with Roosevelt, and he had gone into the anteroom. He was the head of OSS, and a friend of his, who's been the head of the OSS in Italy operating, was sitting in the hallway, and who's my friend. And so he came out, his face was ashen. It's over. It's over. The right wing had taken over because Roosevelt's death was the last bastion for what we were committed to. And so therefore we got into this process under Truman, which was really dictated really by Churchill and company. For example, Roosevelt was concerned immediately with the elimination of all colonialism, all imperialism, and to create a system of freeing nation states. And the idea of the United Nations was to have a repository and take all the parts of the world which were colonies, especially British colonies, but other colonies, or semi-colonies, and to free them from colonial status, and to have a vehicle, which was the United Nations, which was supposed to be an entry point for each of these countries to have a national sovereign status provided to them as a vehicle by the United Nations. That didn't happen. The first thing that happened is in the case of Indochina, the British went in there with backing of Truman, and the Japanese prisoners of war were released from the camps and told by the British to resume their arms and occupy the Indochina until the British could get the French in there to resume the government. And this policy of Truman and of Churchill and company was the policy of the United States, which was reflected in, say, in the 1970s by Henry Kissinger and company, who proposed that Africa's population should be kept poor, not grow, not increase, and should be prevented from consuming the raw materials which Britain and the United States reserved for their own future. So this tradition, of this Anglo-American tradition, which it became under Truman, was prevalent. And the basis was this, the key basis. Roosevelt had understood, as his ancestor had understood, who founded the Bank of New York, as an ally of Hamilton, that we are a credit system, not a monetary system. And what happened was we were turned into a monetary system, which meant we became a part, in fact, of the empire, the British Empire, the real British Empire, which is a monetary system, not a physical system. It's a monetary system, where we, by constitution, by commitment, are a credit system. And our policy, as Roosevelt defined it, was a fixed exchange rate credit system, which was actually the intention at the beginning, in the founding of our republic. Hamilton's role in establishing this policy of national banking, and then it was embedded in the Constitution and still remains in the Constitution as a principle. Under our Constitution, financial systems, monetary systems are illegal for the United States. Right? And therefore that has to be the change. It is the free trade system and this globalization process which have created the vulnerability where the nations of Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe, have no sovereignty anymore. No nation on the continent of Europe, Western and Central Europe, has any sovereignty today. They're colonies of the British Empire. That's what the Queen was referring to the other day, last week. I'm talking about that the British Empire, called the Commonwealth, controls 1/3 of the world and is out to control more, which is what she said. The Queen, the little Queen, said that. She said, anyway. So the point is we have to eliminate globalization. Eliminate globalization, we have to eliminate monetarism. It's easy to do now legally because, as you will see, after Friday and Saturday this week, and yesterday too, every part of the world is on the verge of bankruptcy, except Russia and China. Because the Russia and China agreement made just last month, that treaty agreement, establishes the relationship between them as that of credit system to credit system. The Chinese took their credit that they had, which was money owed by the United States to China, and said, we're going to invest it. We're not going to sit there just with a bank account. We're going to invest it. We're going to get something good out of it. And the Russians said, we'll get something good out of it. We'll work together. And other nations in Asia, through Chinese negotiation and Russian negotiation, are pushing this with other countries. We must cooperate. At least the President Putin, Yakunin, Medvedev government. They're pushing this. And we want India in on it. We want the countries of South Asia to be involved in this. Because with that combination and with the resources we have, we know that great good can be done there. If the United States is a partner in this, we know that we can secure the planet. And that's my goal. Other things may be beneficial, but that's my goal. We must do that. We must secure the planet for that kind of alliance, that kind of cooperation. And for a credit system, which is a fixed exchange rate credit system, that is, each of these nations must establish fixed exchange rate agreement among themselves. That way we can, between 1.5% to 2% interest rates, we can create credit for long-term physical investments, which is what's needed. And we're talking about 25 years, 50 years, 100 years. We're talking about stirring up the imagination of people of the world for what we can do, so that every child, when they become conscious of what they are, can say there is a better world waiting for me 50 years from now or 60 years from now. And that's the bond that must tie people together and peoples together, is that kind of thing. So the financial system is dead. It's hopelessly bankrupt. It could not be saved. No one could save it. Because the explanation is simple. It's my triple curve. Actually, back in the 1950s, when I was an executive with a consulting firm, one of my specialties in there was to take a number of industries, including the auto industry in general. And I was on top of this, as a matter of fact, of information and consulting activity. And I knew that the entire system of Detroit was one big fraud. And some of you are probably old enough to have remembered something about this, but really was a fraud. You had a system of automobile manufacturers and dealerships, and that's where the fraud was. The contract of the automobile dealer, who was an independent operator but under contract control of the automobile manufacturing firms and by Wall Street, agreed that when they sold a new car, they would show on their books the price of the new car at list price. Then, if there were trade-in occurred, or where a used car was used as part of the payment for the purchase of a new car, you would take the shortfall and you would charge that to the value of the used car taken in trade in inventory. That was the contract, and all of these auto companies had this contract. This not only happened in the automobile industry, it had spread under the Eisenhower period. It had, from 52 on, 53 on. It has spread throughout all kinds of industries. So that the economy was largely based on a very large margin of these kind of franchise arrangements, where products were sold and the contract was the list price, the manufacturer's list price would always be shown as the income. And on a trade-in, the trade-in would be priced at what was needed to cover the full cash plus trade-in value. So in the summer of that year, 1956, I said to my associates, colleagues, and so forth, we're going to have a very serious recession. The most serious recession of the post-war period is going to occur about February or March of this coming year, because that's the way the structure of the financial system in the United States was at the time. And it happened. Now, since that, my success of my experience in that time, I've always done forecasting, not based on so-called market statistical forecasting, which is bunk. No person who engages in market-based statistical forecasting is any good at forecasting. They may be good at something else, but they're no good at forecasting. They've never hit the button on this one. None of them. And there have been some big arguments. But the method I used then, back later in 1996, I codified it. I codified it because I was involved in the Vatican event on healthcare. And one of my contributions was to try to make clear what the principle was here. And it became known as the triple curve, which I put up prominently in January of 1996. And the triple curve breaks down the most essential feature of an economic process into three elements of commercial elements. One is the utterance of money, monetarism. The second is the use of money as a financial instrument for trade and manufacturing. Thirdly is the physical activity required to produce the product on which a nation depends. Three curves. The model we referred to was the model defined by the 1923 hyperinflation in Germany, which was then occupied Germany. And when the occupation, which was determined by the British and French principally with American collaboration, what they did is they took Germany and put it under reparations conditions. the Germans had to pay the reparations conditions in a timely fashion. When the French occupied the Ruhr, the pressure of this operation became unbearable. So from the spring of that year on, there was a hyperinflationary process began in Germany, in occupied Germany, post-war Germany. And so they began to print money by the state in order to pay the debt to the Versailles creditors, the nations. The result was a threefold effect. You had an hyperinflationary growth in the emission of money. You had a decline as a result of this of actual trade as denominated in financial terms. Thirdly, you had a sharp decline in actual production, physical production. So by November of that year, the German economy blew out in the famous hyperinflation of 1923. What we're now experiencing is what I warned of during the entire period of the 1960s and 1990s and the present decade, is that we were going in that direction. My first communication to the new administration of Clinton was that the danger was, under the present policies, as I indicated to the Clinton administration, was that we were going to go in that direction. And in 1996, I made this explicit by presenting this so-called triple curve function, which illustrates exactly how this kind of economy works. We are now experiencing, since 2007, since summer 2007, we're experiencing what I said was going to happen then, that the Weimar syndrome, the Weimar hyperinflationary syndrome, was now going to begin to hit the United States. And that's what happened with the breakout of the so-called mortgage crisis, which broke out a few days after my July 25th webcast, where I announced this. Since that time, everything done by the US government and by international agencies has been to feed that process. In Germany in 1923, you had a country which was encased by its own borders because the process was imposed on Germany by the Versailles powers. Now you have it, an entire world is under the same kind of process, which is not so legally precisely controlled, but the process is the same. What we are experiencing now is not a recession, is not a depression. We're experiencing a global breakdown crisis with the characteristics of Weimar Germany in 1923. The utterance of so-called money as monetary emission is skyrocketing relative to the physical output of the economy. In the meantime, the physical output and the so-called financial turnover of goods is collapsing, but there's inflation in that sector. So these three factors are working. There's no other way you can actually competently describe what is happening to the US and world economy today, except that. That's what's operating. So I know this. I'm the only scientific authority on this, and I know this. There are other people in the United States who've studied this and know what I'm saying and agree with what I'm saying, scientifically and professionally. But what I've proposed is the only way you can understand what's happening to the world now. And if you want to cure the problems of the world, you've got to start here. That's what you've got to fix. The triple curve is the only competent representation of what the crisis is we're dealing with. And by that standard, this system is now bankrupt and is about to go into a steep Weimar-style collapse unless we intervene to stop it. The only thing that has happened of any significance to tend to stop that is what happened in the agreement between Russia and China, both on the presidency and the government levels, in setting up the recent agreement. That's the only thing that will work. And the only place you can't do it in Europe, because Europe's a slave state, Western Central Europe. They have no sovereignty anymore. They're part of the Euro system. They're slaves. We would like to free those slaves and then they will behave better. But right now they're slaves. We want to free them. But the only way you can free them is an alliance of Russia, China, India, and the United States. If Russia, China, and India, the United States, agree on this, we can save the planet. If we cannot agree on this, we're not going to save the planet. And that's what the issue is. And I'm the authority on this, because no one else has ever understood this thing this way, except there are people in the United States now who in the present study have made the comparison of what I did before and realized that I've been right all along. And that's the only way you can understand this crisis. And what I'm proposing is the only possible way, because you cannot get Western Europe into this right now. They don't have the sovereignty to do it. They can't vote on it. Therefore, we have to free them. We free them by the Russia, China, India, United States policy.